He wasn't really a singer. He was a junkie. His drug was laughter, applause. That Doodle-oo-doo-doo catchphrase. His name was Del Reeves. And Penny DeHaven, she was his handler. Her job was to be the calm voice, the one to keep the chaos from completely taking over the show. That was their contribution. His crazy energy plus her steady voice. It was a formula. It's how they got hits like Landmark Tavern and became regulars on the Opry circuit. But this wasn't a partnership, it was a holding pattern. So what happens when the junkie realizes that his only drug is what's killing him? This isn't a story about joy, it's a story about burnout. The story of the Clown Prince begins, as so many country legends do, in the absolute bedrock of the American experience. Franklin Delano Reeves was born on July 14, 1932, in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Sparta, North Carolina. The year 1932 was not just a date, it was a profoundly difficult time to be born. It was the absolute bottom of the Great Depression. To be born into this world was to be born into scarcity. To be born as Del was, the youngest of 11 children to a poor farming family, was to be born invisible. His father was a laborer, his mother a homemaker, and their lives were a daily, grinding, almost biblical struggle for basic survival. This was the world that forged Del Reeves, and it is the absolute key to understanding his entire larger-than-life persona. Think for one moment what it means to be the 11th and final child in a one-room Appalachian shack with no money, barely enough food, and two parents long past the point of exhaustion. It means you are last. You are the smallest. Your voice is the quietest. You are, in essence, in a constant, desperate competition for a scrap of attention, a scrap of food, a scrap of existence. In that environment, a child has two choices. They can become withdrawn, silent, and resigned, a ghost in their own home, or they can become loud. Young Del Reeves, with a mind that was already quick and sharp, learned a fundamental lesson before he could even write his own name. A quick wit, a joke, or a sudden infectious burst of laughter was the most valuable currency he possessed. Humor, for him, was not just a personality trait. It was a survival strategy. It was how you deflected the palpable misery of the depression. It was how you charmed your mother into giving you the last piece of bread. It was how you made your father, exhausted and calloused from the mines or the fields, crack a rare, tired smile. It was quite simply a survival mechanism. We hear that his older brothers taught him to play the guitar, but in this context, the guitar wasn't just a toy, it was a tool, it was a prop, it was a shield to hide behind, and an amplifier for his already burgeoning personality. A quiet, soulful musician might play in a corner for himself. A performer, a survivor like Del, stands in the middle of the floor and makes himself the center of gravity. He was not yet a professional, but he was already a showman. His audience was his own family, and the stakes were not applause. They were recognition. This skill, born from the anxiety of invisibility, was about to be professionalized at a shockingly young age. In 1944, the tide of World War II was turning in Europe, but in North Carolina, Del Reeves was just 12 years old, and he was already getting a job. He began to sing on WPAQ, a powerful radio station in nearby Mount Airy, North Carolina. He became a regular on a popular Saturday show called The Merry-Go-Round. We should pause to understand the significance of that. This was not a school talent show. The Merry-Go-Round was a live professional jamboree, a junior Grand Ole Opry for the entire region. While other 12-year-old boys were playing baseball or struggling with algebra, Del Reeves was walking into a radio station surrounded by adult musicians, seasoned fiddle players, banjo pickers, and singers who had been playing these circuits for decades. He had to hold his own. And he couldn't do it on musical virtuosity alone. He did it with charisma. Imagine that skinny 12-year-old kid stepping up to the live, intimidating microphone. He's learning in real time how to work a crowd he can't even see. He's learning how to time a joke between songs. He's learning how to sell a song, not just sing it. He's learning that his laugh, his quick, folksy charm, is just as important as the notes he's singing. This was his high school. This was his college. This was his apprenticeship. The Clown Prince persona was not born in Nashville in the 1960s. It was forged on the airwaves of WPAQ in 1944. The laughter, the jokes, the doodle-oo-doo-doo, it was all a polished, professionalized version of the same survival mechanism he'd learned at the dinner table. It worked. It got him applause. It got him paid. And it confirmed in his young mind that this was his path. This was his way out. He finished high school in Sparta, but the mountains now felt restrictive. He had seen a glimpse of the outside world, and he wanted all of it. Like so many other poor country boys of his generation, Johnny Cash, Elvis Presley, Carl Perkins, he saw the one respectable government-paid escape route, the military. Sometime around 1950, just as the conflict in Korea was beginning to ignite, Franklin Delano Reeves enlisted in the United States Air Force. This was his university. The military, for a man with his specific set of skills, was not about combat. It was about community. It was a captive audience. It was a place to get out of the mountains, to see the world, and to get paid while doing it. We don't have records of him as a spy like Cash or a frontline soldier. His contribution was, as it had always been, morale. He was the guy with the guitar in the barracks. He was the guy who could organize a show in the service club. He was the fast-talking, charming, hilarious kid from Carolina who could make a homesick soldier from Alabama forget his troubles for an hour. He was polishing the act. He was learning to command a room, not of quiet radio listeners, but of rough, lonely, bored, and often drunk young men. This is where the Clown Prince persona was hardened. He wasn't just a funny kid anymore. He was a professional. He was the master of ceremonies, the one-man show, the human equivalent of a shot of whiskey and a letter from home. After his discharge, he was a man in his early 20s. He was a veteran. He was a seasoned radio performer. He was a polished stage act, and he was married. In 1956, he wed his wife, Ellen Scheel. With this marriage came a new, profound pressure. He wasn't just performing for attention or for fun anymore. He had a family to support. He had to make it real. He didn't go to Nashville. Not yet. Nashville in the mid-50s was becoming slick, polished, and controlled by the Nashville sound of producers like Chet Atkins. Del's sound was still too raw. It was that high-energy, half-crazy blues and country mix that was finding a new home. He went to California. This was the other Nashville. The Bakersfield Modesto scene was the new frontier. It was a haven for the rougher, honky-tonk West Coast sounds, a place where the music was electric, loud, and built for dance halls, not for string sections. Del Reeves, with his rockabilly-inflected high-energy style, fit right in. He landed the perfect job, the one that would serve as his final apprenticeship. He began working at radio station KTRB in Modesto. This right here is one of the great secret weapons of country music history, a path shared by legends like Bill Anderson and Willie Nelson. Del Reeves became a DJ. This was not just a side gig. This was a master class in the business of hit-making. He wasn't just singing songs, he was choosing them. He sat in that booth day after day watching the hot board. He saw in real time what the audience responded to. He learned what made a song a hit. From the other side of the microphone, more importantly, he was on the air. He was filling dead air. He was learning how to talk. This is where his famous fast-talking, relentlessly charismatic on-air persona was born. He wasn't just Del Reeves. He was your buddy, Del Reeves, the guy who made the morning commute bearable. He was working alongside and learning from a major West Coast country star and radio pioneer named Chester Smith. He was Smith's sidekick, his protege. He was learning from a master of this new symbiotic world of radio and live performance. But this too was an illusion of joy. On the air at KTRB, he was a star. He was the life of the party, the king of Modesto radio. But when he clocked out, the reality of the 1950s came crashing down. He was a regional celebrity, and he was still broke. The money wasn't enough. He was a family man, and the clown couldn't pay all the bills. He was still living the life he thought he had escaped. He was a radio star who, after his shift, would go work in a factory. He was a manual laborer, his hands, the same ones that played the guitar on stage, getting calloused from hard, anonymous work. This double life created an immense, unsustainable pressure. The mask had to be perfect. The man who was exhausted, sweating, and worrying about rent had to walk into that radio booth, flip the on-air switch, and instantly become the happiest, most carefree man in California. The performance was no longer just a skill. It was a grueling, daily necessity. He poured all this frustrated energy into his music. This was his way out. He was a local star with a radio show. Surely the big labels would see the potential. He began cutting demos, channeling all his influences, the Appalachian folk of his childhood, the heartbreak of his heroes Hank Williams and Lefty Frizzell, and the raw, electric, almost frantic energy of his new rockabilly home. He sent them to Capitol. He sent them to Decca, and the big labels rejected them. They all flopped. This was not a minor setback. It felt like a catastrophic failure. Del Reeves was no longer a 12-year-old kid on WPAQ. He was a man in his late 20s. He was a military veteran. He was a radio professional. He had paid his dues 10 times over, and he was being told once again that he wasn't good enough. Why? The music was wrong. It was 1958, 1959. His sound was in a creative no man's land. It was too rockabilly for a Nashville that was moving towards the smooth, string-laden Nashville sound. It was too country for a national pop chart that was obsessed with teen idols from Philadelphia. He was a man without a genre. This is the moment the clown almost faltered. This is the moment the mask almost cracked. He was a failure. He was back where he started. He was, in his worst nightmares, just a charming factory worker with a good radio voice, destined to be the local hero who never made it. It's important to clear up a myth that often surfaces here. Due to the Cochran name confusion, some stories have mistakenly linked Del Reeves to the Cochran brothers duo. This is, as the outline confirms, incorrect. The Cochran brothers were a separate act, a partnership between Eddie Cochran and Hank Cochran, neither of whom were related to Del. Del Reeves was not part of their act. He was, as he had always been, a true original, a solo act, on his own lonely, frustrating path. That path had now hit a dead end. California had rejected him. The labels had rejected him. He was a performer with no stage, a radio host playing everyone's hits but his own. There was only one place left to go. The one place he had perhaps avoided, knowing his raw hillbilly sound wasn't what they wanted. The lion's den. The unfeeling corporate and final arbiter of his dreams. In the early 1960s, with his rockabilly past all but dead, Del Reeves packed up his family and his indefatigable performing joyful mask. He was going to Nashville. He was going to take one last desperate shot at the big time. While Del Reeves, a man now in his 30s, was making his last-ditch move to Nashville, Running from a decade of professional failures in California, a new generation was emerging. A generation that had not lived through the Depression, but had grown up in its long, post-war shadow. A generation that would bridge the gap between Del's hillbilly rockabilly roots and the slick pop charts of the future. This brings us to our second path. It begins 16 years after Del's, on May 17, 1948, in Winchester, Virginia. Marilyn Jean Penny DeHaven was born into a world defined by the same Appalachian struggles as Del's, but in a different post-war era. She, too, was born into a working-class family, and she, too, found her escape not in humor, but in the sacred, emotional power of music. Her first stage was not a rowdy honky-tonk or a radio jamboree. It was the church. This is the fundamental difference between our two characters. Del Reeves learned to perform as a defense, using laughter to deflect misery and gain attention. Penny DeHaven learned to perform as an expression, using her voice to channel the deep communal faith of the gospel. He was a comedian. She was a conduit. She grew up singing hymns, her voice, even at a young age, possessing a rare combination of power, purity, and a mature, soulful ache. She was a small-town prodigy, a regular at local events, the girl with the big voice that seemed destined for something more than Winchester. Her path to Nashville was more direct, more focused than Del's decade-long meandering journey through the military and California radio. She arrived in Music City in the late 1960s, a young woman with a clear, defined goal. She was part of a new, ambitious wave of female artists who, inspired by the trailblazing successes of Patsy Cline and Loretta Lynn, were coming to town not just to sing, but to compete. She was signed almost immediately to a major label, Capitol Records, and taking on the professional stage name Penny DeHaven, she released her first singles. But this is where her story differs so crucially from Del's. Del's persona was about deflecting emotion with comedy. Penny's was about channeling it with a pop sensibility. She was not a traditionalist. She was a true and perhaps underrated country pop innovator. In an era when Nashville was still deeply conservative, Penny was recording pop songs. This was a bold, almost risky move. She released a sophisticated, country-inflected version of the Beatles' I Feel Fine. She took on the heartbreaking Everly Brothers ballad, Crying in the Rain. With these song choices, she was sending a clear signal to the industry. She was not just another girl singer in a gingham dress, destined to sing songs about being a long-suffering wife. She was a modern, sophisticated, and intelligent vocalist. She had her eye on the pop charts. She was an artist who could straddle the line between the sacred stage of the Opry and the teenage world of American bandstand. And in 1969, she had her first taste of success. Her song, Mama Lou, was released. It was a solid, catchy country pop tune, a perfect showcase for her clear, emotional voice. It broke into the Billboard country chart, peaking at a respectable number 34. This was her breakthrough. It wasn't a girl on the Billboard-sized, earth-shattering smash, but it was a start. It was a validation. It got her noticed. It established her as a new, fresh, and marketable voice in a town crowded with hopefuls. However, like so many women in the male-dominated, iron-fisted world of 1960s Nashville, that initial success proved to be a different kind of trap. A hit like Mama Lou didn't guarantee a career. It just started a clock. The industry was notoriously fickle with its female artists. You were only as good as your next hit. Her subsequent singles failed to match that success. They were good songs, but they didn't catch fire. The label's promotion cooled. She was, as the outline for our story notes, running headlong into the inherent gender barriers of the time. It was one thing to be a girl singer who had a hit. It was another thing entirely to be given the full A-list promotional backing, the choice of the best songs, and the creative control to build a sustainable album-oriented career. That was a privilege reserved almost exclusively for the men. A woman was often seen as an investment with a short shelf life. If she couldn't prove her bankability in 2 or 3 singles, the label would simply move on to the next pretty face with a good voice. It is also important at this juncture to clear up a common misconception that often arises about her career, a piece of apocrypha that gets tangled in the timelines. Because of the era and her immense talent, Penny DeHaven is sometimes mistakenly inserted into the famous, almost mythological narrative of the Porter Wagoner Show. Let's be clear, Penny DeHaven never replaced Norma Jean, nor was she the one who was famously and dramatically replaced by Dolly Parton. That is a separate, iconic story belonging to those specific artists. Penny's journey was different. She was a frequent and beloved guest on many of the big television shows of the time. She was a known, respected, and working-class member of the Nashville community, but she was fighting her own battle on her own front. By the end of 1969, Penny DeHaven was a respected, highly talented vocalist with a chart hit to her name. But her solo career had hit a very real and firm institutional barrier. She was in a kind of mid-chart purgatory, too successful to be unknown, but not successful enough to be a priority. She was in desperate need of a new platform, a new high-profile opportunity to showcase her world-class voice to the millions she knew she could reach. And just across town, Del Reeves, the 30-something failure from California, was about to find a ridiculous song about a billboard and become the biggest, most bankable, and most unlikely superstar in country music. Their two paths, one stalled by failure and the other by a lack of opportunity, were about to converge. When Del Reeves arrived in Nashville in the early 1960s, he was just one of 1,000 struggling artists. He was a man in his early 30s, an age when many artists are already considered veterans. He was a failure from California, a radio DJ whose own rockabilly-inflected demos had gone nowhere. He was a man with a wife and family, a charismatic performer whose act was seen by the slick, string-laden Nashville sound producers as dated too hillbilly, too raw. He signed a contract with Decca and then another with United Artists. He released a string of singles. They were well-crafted. They were professionally produced. And they were, by and large, completely ignored. He was, once again, that invisible 11th child from Sparta, North Carolina. He was, once again, the factory worker, the man on the outside of the party, watching everyone else succeed. The Mask of the Clown Prince was a performance, but it wasn't paying the bills. He was at the end of his rope, his last shot at the big time, seemingly misfiring. And then, in 1965, came the song. The one glorious, ridiculous, and absolutely perfect song that would change his life and the sound of country radio forever. It was called Girl on the Billboard. The song was a cultural bolt of lightning. It was a novelty song, a style of country music that tells a humorous, catchy, gimmicky story. This one was about a truck driver who becomes so obsessed with a painted-on image of a woman on a billboard, a woman wearing nothing but a towel and a smile, that he drives past it every day, forming a one-way relationship. It was silly. It was simple. It was slightly suggestive. And it was exactly what America wanted to hear. Girl on the Billboard was a national phenomenon. It didn't just climb the charts, it devoured them. It rocketed to #1 on the Billboard country chart and stayed there for 2 weeks. It crossed over to the pop charts. It sold over 1 million copies, earning Del a gold record. It was, in every sense of the word, a monster. Del Reeves, the 33-year-old factory worker, the failed rockabilly singer, the man who had been rejected by every major label, was overnight the biggest and most bankable star in country music. This was not just a hit, it was an identity. The song single-handedly kicked off the entire truck-driving song craze of the 1960s and 70s. Del Reeves hadn't just gotten lucky. He had accidentally tapped into the bloodstream of a new emerging American folk hero, the long-haul trucker. His follow-ups were just as perfect, and they brilliantly cemented his newfound persona. He wasn't singing about prison or cheating or the bottle. He was singing about the bells of Southern Belle, a humorous, fast-talking ode to the telephone operators of the Southern Bell Company. He was singing a Doodle-oo-doo-doo, a song literally built around his infectious manic laugh and his signature catchphrase. He was singing "Getting Any Feed for Your Chickens." He was, in short, the Clown Prince. He had found the secret. He had found the gimmick, the survival mechanism he had learned as that invisible 11th child, using humor, charm, and a loud, infectious laugh to get noticed, was now his brand. And he was finally getting paid for it. In 1968, he struck gold again with "Looking at the World Through a Windshield." It was another truck-driving smash, a high-octane, amphetamine-paced celebration of the trucker's life that hit number 5 on the charts. The Clown Prince had been crowned. In 1966, in what was the ultimate symbol of his arrival, he was invited to become a member of the Grand Ole Opry. This was the inner sanctum. This was the validation he had craved his entire life. He, the kid from Sparta, who had listened to the Opry on a battery-powered radio, was now a permanent, lifetime member of its cast. He was a superstar, but this success, as it so often does, came with a high price. It was a creative trap. Del Reeves was now trapped inside the very persona he had so perfectly created. He was the funny guy. He was the novelty guy. He was the Doodle-oo-doo-doo man. The industry, the radio stations, and the audience now had an expectation. They didn't want him to sing a heartbreaking ballad. They didn't want him to be a serious, introspective artist. They wanted the laugh. They wanted the gimmick. They wanted the fast-talking, 6'5" manic whirlwind of joy. This is the classic paradox of the entertainer. The very act that makes you famous becomes the one thing you can never, ever escape. Del was a brilliant musician. He was a student of Hank Williams and Lefty Frizzell. He had a deep, resonant, and powerful voice that was capable of great emotion, but he was now, and perhaps forever, the novelty singer. It was a mask he had created for survival as a child, polished as a DJ and perfected as a star, and it was a mask he could now never, ever take off in public. His struggle, as the outline for our story notes, wasn't with a person. It was with labels. It was a creative war. He would jump from label to label, from Decca to United Artists and beyond, constantly fighting for creative control. He would try to slip in a serious ballad, a heartfelt song, but the label executives would push back. "Where's the gimmick, Del? Where's the laugh? Give us another billboard." This internal struggle is the hidden tragedy of Del Reeves. He had achieved the American dream, and he had done it by presenting a one-dimensional, joyful caricature of himself. He had won, but the price was his own artistic depth. His public persona was all jokes and laughter, but as his biography shows, he was not a simple man. He was a shrewd, intelligent, and often frustrated artist. The Clown Prince image was not who he was. It was the job he performed, and it was an exhausting one. While Del was becoming the king of the novelty hit and wrestling with the confines of his golden cage, Penny DeHaven was still fighting her own, quieter, and more frustrating battle. She was, in every way, his opposite. While Del was recording a Doodle-oo-doo-doo, she was in the studio, the pop queen, the serious modern vocalist, recording her sophisticated covers of the Beatles and the Everly Brothers. While Del's problem was being too successful with a gimmick, Penny's problem was not being commercially successful enough with her art. She had the respect of her peers, she had the voice, she had the pop sensibility, but she was a woman in the late 60s, and she was stuck. She was facing the gender barriers of an industry that was happy to have girl singers as duet partners or as opening acts, but was deeply hesitant to invest the full A-list promotional budget into them as serious album-oriented artists. She struggled, as the outline notes, to get the green light for a full, cohesive album that represented her true vision. She was in a constant fight for her own artistic identity, not against a gimmick, but against an industry that simply wouldn't take her as seriously as her male counterparts. She was, in essence, the anchor, but she had no ship. By 1970, the musical world of Nashville was defined by these two parallel and deeply frustrated artists. On one side, you had Del Reeves. He was the biggest, loudest, funniest, and most commercially bankable star at the Opry. He had his own syndicated television show, Del Reeves's Country Carnival, a whirlwind of comedy skits, hay bales, and music. He was an unstoppable force of nature, but one who was creatively pigeonholed by his own overwhelming success. He was all chaos. On the other side, you had Penny DeHaven. She was the respected, soulful, modern vocalist. She was all control. But she was a solo artist struggling to break through the industry's thick glass ceiling, a brilliant singer who couldn't get her voice heard above the noise. He was a showman who desperately needed a dose of artistic credibility. She was a serious artist who desperately needed a dose of mainstream exposure. He was the chaos. She was the control. He was the joke. She was the soul. Individually, they were both in their own unique ways hitting a wall. But together they were the perfect, untapped chemical equation. It wasn't a romance. It was, in the cold, hard, brilliant calculation of show business, a perfect idea. The 1970s dawned, and the era of the great country duet was in full swing. It was the golden age of the he said, she said narrative. Conway Twitty and Loretta Lynn were the fiery, working-class married couple. George Jones and Tammy Wynette were the real-life bi-tragedy, their pain bleeding onto the vinyl. Porter Wagoner and Dolly Parton were the glamorous, rhinestone-covered and deeply fractured mentor-protege act. The formula was electric. Combine two distinct, often conflicting personalities and watch the sparks fly. Del Reeves, by this point, was not just a star. He was an industry. His syndicated television show, Del Reeves's Country Carnival, was a massive success beamed into homes across America. He was the clown prince, a beloved 6'5" whirlwind of manic energy. But a one-man whirlwind can become exhausting. A comedian, to be truly effective, needs a straight man. A chaotic force needs a calm center. Del, the consummate showman, knew this. He didn't need another clown to compete with. He had that covered. He needed the opposite. He needed a world-class, serious vocalist who could ground his manic energy, someone who could sing the straight lines with absolute sincerity and class. He needed an anchor. Across town, Penny DeHaven, the brilliant, pop-inflected singer, was in a frustrating holding pattern. Her solo career, despite her talent and a respectable chart hit, was stalled, a victim of the industry's glass ceiling. She was a world-class singer who was, in effect, waiting in the wings. She needed a platform. She needed a way to get her voice in front of the millions of people who watched television and listened to A-list radio. She needed a star. Their partnership was not a romance. It was not a dark, controlling mentorship like the one brewing between Hank Cochran and Jeannie Seely. It was, as the outline for our story confirms, something far more stable and in its own way far more brilliant. It was a mutually beneficial, entirely professional collaboration. It was a perfect piece of casting. In 1970, they went into the studio and released their first major duet, Landmark Tavern. It was an immediate hit, climbing to a solid number 20 on the Billboard country charts. The chemistry was undeniable. It was the classic straight man in the comic routine, perfected for country radio. Del would sing his humorous, slightly off-the-wall, character-driven verses, his voice full of that famous fast-talking salesman charm. And then, just as his chaotic energy was about to spin out of control, the song would shift. Penny would come in with her soaring, soulful, and perfectly in-tune chorus. Her voice was the song's conscience, its emotional core. She was the musical and thematic anchor that made the whole performance believable. The public loved it. They became a regular, beloved pairing. They were a fixture on his television show and at the Grand Ole Opry. They were the fun couple. They weren't singing about divorce or cheating. They were singing about the ups and downs of everyday life, with a wink and a smile. This partnership for Penny DeHaven was the opportunity she had been fighting for. It was a game changer. It instantly elevated her status. She was no longer just another struggling solo act. She was now the other half of one of the Opry's biggest and most visible acts. She was finally in the A-list spotlight. She capitalized on this new momentum. In 1972, she released her first full self-titled album, Penny DeHaven. It was the creative statement she had been waiting to make, filled with the sophisticated pop country covers that defined her style. It was highly praised by critics, solidifying her reputation as a vocalist of serious top-tier talent. For Del, the partnership was a crucial musical lifeline. Penny's serious pop-infused vocals gave his act a new layer of class. She was the velvet glove on his ironclad gimmick. She was the prestige that made the joke respectable. Her presence proved that beneath the Doodle-oo-doo-doo and the trucker anthems, Del Reeves was a serious, first-rate musician and a man of taste. She grounded him. But the dynamic, while professionally supportive and personally amicable, was a perfect and perhaps troubling reflection of the industry's deeply ingrained gender imbalance at the time. He was the star. He was the one with the television show. He was the one whose name came first on the record, Del Reeves and Penny DeHaven. She was, despite her immense talent, in the supporting role. She was the anchor, but the anchor, by definition, is often unseen, doing the heavy work while the ship gets the attention. It was a brilliant, functional, and successful partnership. But it was also fleeting. Their collaboration was as brief as it was bright. They re-recorded Crying in the Rain together in 1972, the song Penny had so deftly covered as a solo artist. But the duet this time failed to make a significant chart impact, peaking at a minor number 54. The musical tides were turning again, violently. By 1972, the polished showbiz act of the country carnival was beginning to feel dated. The Nashville sound was giving way to something darker, grittier, and more authentic. The outlaw movement, led by the very men Del had known in his early days, Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings, was taking hold. The audience, weary from the Vietnam War and social upheaval, didn't want jokes as much as they wanted raw, authentic pain. The formula of the clown prince and the pop queen was growing old. Their partnership, having served its purpose, dissolved as quietly and professionally as it had begun. There was no divorce. There was no war. It was just over. They both moved on. Del Reeves, the clown prince, his string of novelty hits now drying up, was about to face his first truly serious, unfunny challenge. His health. Penny DeHaven, the pop queen, her brief moment in the A-list spotlight now fading, was about to face a future where the pop charts and the country charts were moving further and further apart, leaving her stranded in the middle. The curtain was coming down on their shared golden era. The long, slow fade was about to begin. The mid-1970s marked the beginning of a long, slow, and irreversible fade from the commercial spotlight for both Del Reeves and Penny DeHaven. The hits, which had once come so easily for Del, and which Penny had fought so hard to get, now dried up completely. The musical world they had briefly dominated was once again changing beneath their feet. The outlaw movement had fully taken over, and the polished, primetime country carnival act felt like a relic from a more innocent time. The industry, as it always does, had moved on. But this is where the true character of both artists, the core forged in Appalachian poverty and professional struggle, was truly revealed. Their story was no longer about climbing the charts. It was about endurance. It was about how one maintains the illusion of joy when the applause, the hits, and the television cameras are all gone. For Del Reeves, the end of his chart-topping run meant a full-scale focus on his professional home, the Grand Ole Opry. He had been a proud lifetime member since 1966. The Opry was not like the radio charts. It didn't care about your last hit. It cared about legacy. It was a family, a home. And Del, with his massive, gregarious personality, was one of its greatest ambassadors. He was no longer topping Billboard, but he was still a massive draw on the road, a star on the lucrative state fair and club circuit. He was Del Reeves, the Clown Prince. That name still meant something. It meant a show. It meant a guaranteed good time. He also wisely pivoted. He became an artist manager, working with smaller labels, trying to shepherd the next generation of talent. He was, in effect, becoming a version of the radio man turned mentor, Chester Smith, who had helped him back in California. He was a savvy businessman, a survivor who knew how to adapt. But as he entered his 50s, a terrible, cruel, and profound irony began to take hold. Del Reeves, the man whose entire act was built on air, the man whose living depended on his powerful, booming 6'5" voice, the man whose signature, his calling card, was the breathless, rapid-fire, almost manic Doodle-oo-doo-doo, and that huge, infectious laugh was diagnosed with a emphysema. It is a cruel, slow, and suffocating disease of the lungs. It is a progressive, irreversible condition where the air sacs in the lungs are damaged, making it harder and harder to breathe. For any singer, it is a terrifying diagnosis. For a singer like Del Reeves, whose entire persona depended on an endless, powerful supply of breath and lung power, it was a living nightmare. It was a cosmic, tragic joke. The Clown Prince was now in private, fighting for every single breath. The mask of joy, the relentless, high-energy performance was becoming physically, agonizingly difficult to maintain. Yet he never let it drop. This is the true hidden courage of Del Reeves. He continued to perform. He continued to tour, even as his health failed. He would walk out onto the stage of the Grand Ole Opry, hit the spotlight, and the man who was struggling for oxygen would disappear, replaced by the persona of Del Reeves, the laughing, joking, larger-than-life showman. He would deliver his final joke, sing his final Doodle-oo-doo-doo, and then, behind the curtain, out of sight, he would gasp for air, clinging to a wall, utterly exhausted. It was the most convincing and most heartbreaking performance of his entire life. While Del was waging this private physical war, Penny DeHaven was on a different, quieter, but equally profound journey. Her fade from the charts was just as complete. The industry had moved on. She released a few more singles into the mid-1970s, but soon found a new niche, a comfortable lateral move, performing and recording with another famous country character act, Boxcar Willie. Like her partnership with Del, this was a professional role. She was, once again, the talented, stable anchor to a charismatic, gimmicky male star. She had, in effect, found herself typecast, the industry seeing her value as the serious foil to a novelty act. But as the 1980s progressed, Penny, the woman who had started her career covering the Beatles and chasing a pop crossover dream, found herself pulled in a new, or rather, a very old direction. She returned to her first love, the music she sang as a child in Winchester, Virginia, the music that had been her anchor long before she became Del's. She returned to gospel. This was not a commercial pivot. This was a personal one. This was not a commercial compromise, but an act of personal and artistic choice. In a world of changing fads, fleeting hits, and industry indifference, she returned to the one thing that was constant, the music that had given her her start. It was a full circle moment. The pop queen was returning to the church. Her music was no longer about chasing the charts. It was about making music for the soul. She continued to perform. She continued to be a beloved member of the Nashville community, but her focus had shifted. She was no longer fighting the industry. She had found a different kind of peace. Del, the showman, was fighting to keep his breath. Penny, the anchor, was finding her spirit. They were on their separate final paths. The new millennium arrived. For Del Reeves, the long, slow, agonizing fight was coming to an end. His emphysema, a relentless, progressive disease, had finally done what no record label or critic ever could. It was silencing him. He was a shadow of the towering, energetic man who had dominated the 1960s. But his spirit and his membership at the Opry remained unbroken. He was a veteran, an elder statesman, a symbol of a bygone, happier era. On January 1st, 2007, at his home in Centerville, Tennessee, Franklin Delano Del Reeves died. He was 74 years old. The official cause of death was chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, emphysema. The laughter had stopped. The clown prince was gone. The man who had built a career on boundless breath and relentless energy had been silenced in the end by a disease of the lungs. It was the final tragic irony of a life built on a public persona of relentless energy. Penny DeHaven continued her quiet, dignified path. She had found her peace in her gospel music. In 2011, she released what would be her final album, A Penny Saved. The title itself was a quiet, perfect summary of her journey. It was a beautiful, heartfelt collection of gospel standards, a final love letter to the music that had shaped her, a fitting bookend to a long and steady career. But she, too, was facing her own private, final battle. She was diagnosed with cancer. On February 23, 2014, just 7 years after her old partner had passed, Penny DeHaven died. She was only 65 years old. The showman and the anchor were both gone, but their story doesn't end there. In the decades since their passing, their legacy has only grown, taking on a new, more profound, and perhaps more accurate meaning. Del Reeves, the novelty singer, the man critics once dismissed as a gimmick, has become immortal. You cannot drive on an American highway today without hearing his voice. Girl on the Billboard and Looking at the World Through a Windshield are no longer novelty songs. They are the sacred anthems of the truck-driving world. They are a vital part of the American songbook, a joyous, defiant sound of freedom and the open road, preserved forever in digital reissues and classic country radio. The Clown Prince, in the end, had the last laugh. The persona he had built from the anxiety of his childhood, the gimmick he had used to get noticed, had become a permanent beloved piece of American culture. And Penny DeHaven, the straight man who had been overshadowed, the anchor whose name was always second, she is now remembered as one of the classic queens of country. Her sophisticated pop-infused vocals, her brave covers of the Beatles, her entire approach to her career, it's now seen correctly as being decades ahead of its time. She helped pioneer the modern crossover sound that would later make superstars out of artists like Shania Twain and Faith Hill. She was the anchor, and we now recognize that without her stability, without her class, and without her talent, the Clown Prince act could never, ever have worked. Their story in the end is not a bi-tragedy. It's a classic American drama. It's a testament to the relentless, back-breaking, and often painful work of entertainment. It's the story of two kids from the Appalachian Mountains who understood, better than anyone, the profound beauty and the profound hardship of Nashville. It's the story of the smile and the soul. Del was the illusion of joy, the chaotic, bright, laughing mask that protected him from the world. Penny was the anchor of talent, the calm, soulful, and professional core that made the illusion believable. Together, in a town built on tears and heartbreak, they gave the world the rare, priceless, and desperately needed gift of a good, honest laugh. And in the long, dark history of the human experience, there is nothing more serious or more lasting than that.